I stand here with a mixed feeling. There is one of great enthusiasm and appreciation, and the other is also a challenge and a concern ahead of us. In terms of enthusiasm and appreciation, one cannot underplay the contribution of India's banking sector in India's growth story. It's a sector which has great credibility. It's a sector which has expanded almost by the day. And it's a sector which, from the interest of the weakest sections of society, the farmers, right up to the large industry, has supported almost every segment of Indian economy. There is hardly a program of the government in which the banking sector has not had an effective role to play. And today, when we look at the sheer size and the expanse, from the rural banks to the cooperative banks, the large public sector banks, the ever-expanding private sector banks, which have done phenomenally well, the payment banks, the small bank licenses being given, the new licenses almost on tap. I think the process of expansion and hence competition, newer technologies, efficiencies, itself is at its very best. And the credit which flows from these institutions has effectively been the lifeline of the economy. Banks have also responded to the challenge of incorporating newer technologies. And as I mentioned just now, the entire social sector schemes of the government, and some of them performed with utmost ability, have been by the staff of the banks itself. There's hardly an international forum where the success of our schemes like the Jan Dhan Yojana is not mentioned. It's today rated as the biggest financial inclusion scheme anywhere in the world. And at various international forums, when I hear men and women of great credibility refer to it, and India is asked to make a presentation on how we did it, that speaks itself of the capacity of our banking system itself. If on one hand this is an area which we celebrate, I think we must not be unmindful of our concerns itself. And I look at each of these concerns with a challenge which all of us have to jointly address and resolve. The capacity of banks to support growth must never be allowed to dilute. And therefore, the banking system and its economic capacity in order to support credit, its capacity to support larger economic activity would always have to be maintained. Indian banks have survived many a regional and global crisis. We've always come out and escaped unhurt in almost each one of them. And therefore, our ability, our resilience to respond to these challenges is never been in doubt. If you look at the big picture as far as the economy is concerned, we are working in an environment where the world has slowed down. And while the world has slowed down, India still remains an isolated spot, which in a slowed down world is still managing to move at a reasonable pace. In a supportive global environment, we can do even much better. And if within the country we look at the direction in which we are moving, I think it's always important that we set for ourselves standards which are higher. And that is the only way we are able to cover up for the backlog, because we still have a lot of distance to cover in order to eradicate poverty, in order to improve upon the quality of life of Indians. We are working in an environment today domestically where state governments, central governments, most of them are moving in a direction which actually represents a popular aspiration for growth, development, progress. And that is why when we look at the last 25 years of the history of economic reforms in India, we are today passing through a phase where taking decisions and implementing them has become far easier than it was in the first phase. An aspirational India is always willing to more actively support change and reform because there is a greater desire itself to grow. And that is perhaps one of the reasons that on policy makers across the country, not only governments but also opposition parties, state governments, all policy makers are also faced with a popular pressure that decisions have to be taken quickly, decisions have to be implemented faster. Obstruction to decision making is not being relished in the system. And that is what makes India stand out from the rest of the world. In this situation, a large number of decisions which have been taken all move in one direction. My interaction with policymakers, investors, both within and outside, over the last several months, I used to be addressed two questions regularly. The first was an obvious question which everybody used to ask. Will India be able to pass the goods and services tax? Will you be able to implement it? And inherent in that question was a lurking doubt that do we continue to have an appetite for continuous and faster reforms? Because in the past we've displayed the fact that we reformed in patches and then slowed down again, and then after a couple of years we again started reforming in patches. And therefore our appetite itself for continuous reforms was being tested every time this question was being asked. And the fact that some of these major reforms have taken place and taken place almost unanimously through both houses of parliament, I think we've adequately answered whatever the skeptics or the questioners did ask. The second important question, which was always addressed and which still continues to be addressed, related to the health of our banking sector, particularly the public sector banks. And I think if we look at the larger picture of the Indian economy, even when services and manufacturing grow at 9% in a slowed down environment, the monsoon looking good, public spending increasing, and probably as a result of the 7th Pay Commission being implemented, the monsoon looking good itself, demand, particularly rural demand, picking up, I think a number of problems themselves can get addressed. The changes which we have anticipated have taken place. Some more would be in the pipeline. Public spending would increase, spending within rural areas would increase, infrastructural spending would increase, and those momentums would be maintained. There are several factors, the oil prices, the global slowdown, commodity prices, not entirely in our own control because international factors impact them. And therefore now, one of our top priorities has to be to strengthen the ability of our banking system to be able to support growth. And hopefully, if growth returns to the rest of the world, demand improves, or at least in India, because of a number of domestic factors which I mentioned, it improves. We have to strengthen the capacity of India's private sector, and for which we need a very robust banking system. So all the steps which we have been taking, and which were just now referred to, and rightly mentioned that in a short span of time, the empowerment of the banks in order to meet these challenges, and these are unprecedented steps which have been taking place. The RBI has been coming out empowering the banks with greater flexibility. The Parliament has enacted the bankruptcy law. The mechanisms under that law are now being established. They're at a fairly advanced stage. The Department of Financial Services has taken the initiative, and both houses of Parliament have approved in a record short period of time important changes to the debt recovery process, as also to the securitization law. The government has been within the limitations in its own fiscal ability, been adding to the capital to the banks itself. And the list of sectors which Mr. Ashwani Kumar just now drew out where you had been facing challenges. And I'm conscious of the fact that these are challenges which have emerged either on account of international factors or domestic factors which have impacted certain sectors of the economy. And therefore, each one of those sectors is being proactively addressed. Our yesterday's decision is otherwise an unprecedented one, wherein in areas of public contracts, where state instrumentalities are involved, public sector bodies or governments are involved. So in the real estate, construction, infrastructure sector, which deals with large projects, if you take the number of arbitral awards and you take the amount of stress to those companies, which consequently results on the stress on the balance sheet of the banks itself, there is an interrelationship between those amounts. And therefore, the government actively took up this matter. We are faced with mechanisms where public servants because of constraints of law, and at times even the fear of future consequences, are unwilling to go in for for fair settlements, because that's the environment in which they function. And therefore, if the issues are pending in court, there are already awards, 75% of the amount be paid to them against bank guarantees, so that the dues of the banks to some extent could be discharged and the projects itself completed, which in turn will have an impact both on the banking system and the economy itself. This is a proactive step that the government has taken. With regard to that section, earlier to that, we'd amended the arbitration law to provide for a cheaper and a fast-track arbitration so that the dispute redressal mechanism itself could be quickly and hastily adjudicated. The steel sector, where the entire world is facing the challenge of excess capacities. And one of the side effects of the excess capacity is that cheaper steel at below the cost prices flows into various jurisdictions. We are not the only country being impacted by it. Countries across the world, in Europe, United States, everybody's been impacted by it. And therefore, a couple of months ago, we took the proactive step of making sure that the capacity of our own steel companies increases by the imposition of the minimum import price itself. And that has impacted to some extent the manufacturing companies in that sector. The power sector, particularly the dues from the state discoms, the Uday scheme was designed really to address problems of that sector. The sugar sector stress, which was just mentioned, I think the increase in the global prices, along with certain steps taken last year by the government, has to a large extent addressed those problems. And therefore, not only are the banks being empowered through legislative and executive decisions, the recapitalization done, the cause of those stresses in each of the sectors is being addressed. I mention this because I do believe that it is also the government's responsibility to make sure that the economic and the commercial environment in which the banks function, if that environment can be favorably altered, that itself would contribute to the capacity of the banks to strengthen themselves and to be able to support growth. I mentioned in the very beginning that amongst various questions which are raised, globally we've been able to address a large number of them. The attitude of the world in looking at India has significantly changed. It's no mean achievement for an Indian economy that for 2 years and hopefully for the future, we place ourselves in our growth potential as amongst the world leaders. We keep bringing about changes and look forward bringing those structural changes, even when developed economies are being now blocked and bogged down by the debate of increased protectionism. It's a great opportunity which is being provided to us. And therefore, in this opportunity, our ability to support growth, notwithstanding an unsupportive global environment, amongst the domestic factors which we need now to address, if I were to be asked a question as to what your priorities at the moment are, some answers are very obvious. We'll need greater spending in the rural areas because that's where larger growth is possible. We'll need both social and physical infrastructure creation. We need to revive private sector investment. And for doing each one of these things, the essential prerequisite is we need to have a robust banking system which is able to support growth across each one of these sectors. And I think that is a kind of a determination. So when you meet for your 69th AGM, you meet keeping in mind that this is a great challenge, and hopefully when we meet for your 70th AGM, you would have demonstrated your resilience